Good afternoon, Tobias. Ellwood. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks very much indeed. Good to see you again.
And you, my friend. Before we talk about Rafah, before we talk about Green candidates, that was a really interesting text from a veteran. Johnny Mercer, I know the Veterans Minister, has been very outspoken. I've also always said to you, when we get into a debate about dinghies and stuff, do we do in this country enough for our veterans, Tobias Ellwood? Because I don't think we do.
You make a very powerful point. Armed forces do an incredible job of watching our backs, keeping us safe. And when they finally pack up their uniform for the last time, slide it across to the quartermaster, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that that transition back into society is as simple as possible, and then make sure they gain the support for the rest of their lives. And I would say to any potential employer, look at the armed forces, because the grit, the tenacity, the determination, the teamwork, the leadership that you've got that's embedded in that individual is second to none. So you'd benefit from it. We need to look after them. There is something called the Veterans Gateway, which I hope all veterans will be familiar with. It brings together the 400 service-leading charities around the country. So if any individual is needing help, whether it be physical, mental, or helping with homelessness or whatever like that, that charity is there to support you. Johnny Mercer, I know, is supportive of it. I was when I was a defense minister as well. Please utilize that, the Veterans Gateway. Very simple way of getting that support. But you're absolutely right. Let's make it absolutely clear. We should be doing everything we can. And there's something called the Covenant, the Armed Forces Covenant, that is signed by law, that signs up councils, businesses, and so on to say, yes, we are going to do everything we can to support. Councils, especially local councils, should be doing everything they can to make sure that the second part of their lives, anybody who served in the military, is looked after as properly
completely agree with you. And you sort of, I'm not into that sort of rhetoric, but you can understand, say with that migrant crisis, somebody who spent 25 years in the army and has been left homeless or ostracised would look at what we seemingly give to, yes, there are legal migrants, but some illegal migrants, and it would be really frustrating. Can we take it further? Tobias, and great to have you on. Two things, really, well, three things I want to talk about in terms of Gaza and Palestine. Israeli military are telling 100,000 people to leave parts of Rafah. It looks like that invasion could be imminent. This on the back of Netanyahu over the weekend rejecting ceasefire demands, saying that it would leave Hamas intact, which rather sums up what I've said before, which is, do and should you negotiate with terrorists? What are your thoughts, Tobias?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I'm glad you're focusing on this. There are so many challenges across the world. As we've said in the past, our world is getting more dangerous, not less. We need to be better at putting fires out, of sorting situations out. But look at Gaza, look at the conflict there. No individual state or individual leader is actually in charge of where events are going. The fighting continues. Israeli hostages are still being held. The humanitarian situation certainly is getting worse. And nobody can actually claim that they're making progress on the battlefield. And I really urge caution to Prime Minister Netanyahu in sending in the tanks into Rafah without a clear strategy as to where this leads. Go back to the military. Any military soldier wants to know, what am I doing? How does my actions actually add to the longer-term, wider strategy of where we're going? And I don't quite see that. I didn't from the very, very beginning, indeed. And that's one of the reasons why Jerusalem has perhaps lost the support from Washington and indeed London, given the massive fallout, the huge damage to infrastructure, and of course, the millions of people, individual Palestinians, that are now caught up with this, with famine spreading right across the Gaza Strip.
And I think that's the point, isn't it? And I said that. I had a very interesting chat earlier with Ismail, a guy from Leicester, who was saying that the Tory government's too right-wing and it doesn't really understand. And I said, you need to look at the problem that there is everybody's jumping up and down saying, we've had this discussion, a ceasefire. The two protagonists, I don't think Netanyahu wants a ceasefire. I think if it wasn't for the war, I think this is a very true point, he wouldn't be in power. I think he probably would be thrown out instantly for allowing that attack to happen. In terms of Hamas, at every toss and turn, Hamas will cause problems. They are a terrorist organisation. Let us not forget that they, along with other people inside Iran and organisations like that, their sole intention is to destroy the Israeli state. So you get, don't you? You know this better than I do, Tobias. You get that feeling that you've got two incredibly polarised sides and a lot of do-gooders across the world, bleeding hearts going, let's have a ceasefire. It needs to be more practical, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you cover so many important points there. Firstly, underlining that it's in Hamas's constitution to want to annihilate and remove the state of Israel. And that removes them from perhaps participating in any long-term governance of the Gaza Strip or indeed the West Bank. The wider challenge here, though, that we face is, so where does this actually go? If you're going to deal with the Hamas, you can't avoid it. You have to acknowledge that this is Iran sitting behind Hamas, as it does behind Hezbollah and the Houthis as well. And I'm afraid it goes back to us in the West that for the last decade and a half, we've done very little to prevent Iran from building up its capability, its confidence, its influence right across the Middle East. But having said that, we also need to make sure that what Israel does not inflame the situation. Charging into Rafah when already there isn't enough aid getting into the country, where now the international community is having to build its own maritime entrance into Gaza to prevent, a colossal famine taking place, as the UN have indicated might be the case. Only less than 1/5 of the aid trucks are getting through, and Israel could do far, far more or rather Netanyahu could, because I know that this is something very testing with the Israelis and indeed the Jewish community here in the UK.
I completely agree. Listen, it's always great to have you on. I want to throw a couple of other things. Let's go from Gaza to the news this afternoon. This started last week. Protests at quite high elite universities in the United States. Don't know if you saw that ludicrous thing on TikTok. This sort of 25-year-old PhD student, they set up a camp and she came out, she did an interview with Fox, and she said basically, it's like, we need humanitarian aid. It's like a siege in there. And everybody was screaming at the television, go and order Uber Eats. We hear today, pro-Palestinian students, Tobias, have set up encampments at Oxford and Cambridge and vowed not to move until the demands are met. Not sure what those demands are. More than 50 people got tents, gazebos and supplies. Tobias, Ellwood, your response to this? I understand people feel passionate, but this is yet another, it's just hijacking something, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, don't forget I had some demonstrations outside of my house not long ago. And there is an absolute right to be able to demonstrate in this country, and we value that. But it needs to be done responsibly. And I think what we're seeing is a copying of what's going on in the American campuses, at the American universities as well. But, when you dig down a little bit further, we now have a United Nations Security Council resolution. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, were pushing for that for some time. It's now in place. And yet that was the reason why people were demonstrating outside of Parliament, if you remember, causing all that commotion and so forth. We have to be responsible here. And I wish those voices that are understandably critical about, as I've been, about the utility of force that Israel's using, would also equally condemn Hamas and what they did on the 7th of October, and the fact that, as you started to begin with, to say they still want to see the annihilation of the Israeli state.
And there's your thing. When I had Ismail on earlier, I understand majority of Muslims do not like what they are seeing any more than a majority of the rest of the world likes what's happening in Gaza. But you need to condemn that genocide and not justify it by saying for years. Can I further I love talking to you, man. Can I take it further? What do you think as a politician? You're Bournemouth East, you've got to hold your constituency together. You'll be fighting for that seat later in the year. Still waiting for my leaflets, no comment. I saw that appalling image, Tobias. That green, well, I call him a green candidate. I don't care that he's Muslim. I don't care that he shouts Ali Akbar. What I care about is that our politics is becoming sectarian, that a Green Party councillor who doesn't even mention, green issues in any way can win election based on that, a bit like Galloway. Where does it end, Tobias Ellwood?
Yeah, I mean, you make a very powerful point. I mean, for me, and I think for many people, particularly the younger generation, where climate change is going, we saw the rainfall in places like Dubai and Saudi Arabia. We've got to address the fact that because of the planet's warming, it is the biggest existential threat that we face, and we need to be responsible for how we go about it. But when you have a Green Party, which, as I say, you may disagree or agree with what they're doing, but they do it in a very clear-cut, respectful way. When you have a party like this, what looks like, and I choose my words carefully, hijacked for another cause, then you have to ask yourself. So I pose it as a question rather than actually as an accusation. It is for the Green Party to respond as to what's happening within their own ranks, as to whether they're losing sight of their respected cause that we all usually know them for.
Absolutely agree. And if they do an investigation, it's too late now. He's been elected, so he'll sit as an independent, which is frightening. Finally, Tobias, I'm so glad you joined us on this Bank Holiday Monday. Let's talk about the local elections. It's really interesting watching the fallout, not on a Friday. Terrible result in Blackpool South. Scott Benton obviously done for lobbying. That was always going to happen, I think, in terms of the swing was huge to Labour. Across the country, you could hear two sort of voices. Certain Tories around Rishi were going, you know, it's not so good. We're going to hold on to what Mr Thrasher said, the old economist man, the man with the polls, and he's saying, you know, if this happened, it could be a hung parliament. Come on, Rishi, be a bit more out there, be a bit more lean. Let's get a bit more Tory. Let's do this, that, and the other. Others are saying it's just a matter of time. Those are local elections. Where do you stand on this? Is it, let's say it's 6 months. Can your leader in the next 6 months, if he's a bit more vocal and a bit more Tory and takes the fight to Labour, can he change people's opinions? Because I thought the most interesting thing was this. Many people were writing over the weekend saying the disillusionment with the Tories is the issue for the Tories. There is not massive love for Keir Starmer. Isn't that something to build on if you're Rishi Sunak?
Yeah, well, you cover a lot there again. And give me a second just to establish 3 points, if I may, very, very quickly. 3 points. Firstly is, if you're an observer of British elections, there is a sweet spot in the centre, the floating voter, that a lot of them stayed at home. 20%, 30% turnout, 70% at the general election. So a lot of them have stayed at home. That is the sweet spot. If you grab that, as Tony Blair did in his time, he looked a little bit like a Tory. He grabbed that centre ground. Churchill did. Thatcher did in her time as well. Look beyond your party. Take your party with you, but look beyond it. If you go to your extremes like Jeremy Corbyn did, you then make yourself unelectable. I make that really, really clear, because some people think, oh, let's be more right-wing and we're going to get more votes. It doesn't work that way, but we can debate that. Second observation is things are a lot closer than I was believing, and indeed we've discussed in the past. 20 points people were saying in those polling. No, Thrashers, and indeed Sir John Curtis, the most respected voice of polling, is now saying 9 points difference between our two. When the election comes in, things narrow, always during a campaign. So we could be within 5 or 6 points apart. That's within a zone. My final observation is the British electorate wants to see two things simply from any party. Firstly, that you've got the economy in order, so it's in good hands. So as an individual, as a business, you can do well. Secondly, that the party exhibits the leadership, the discipline, and the vision that Britain expects from number 10. On the first one, inflation going down, investment in defence, we've got welfare reform taking place, the inflation, as I say, going the right direction and so forth. That is now, after a turbulent period, getting in the right direction. The second piece of party discipline and unity is still not there. Get the second bit right, and I think those polls will close even further. So all this talk about, oh, this is now the Prime Minister's, Rishi Sunak's, for him to get us out of this hole. No, it's for every one of us, whether you are a parliamentarian or one of the root and branch members, you know, delivering leaflets on the ground, like unto your doors. We all need to work together. Let's be a bit more JFK about this. Let's all of us ask ourselves what we can do to help support Rishi Sunak, because we're not going to change the leaders between now and the election. That would simply be mad. Let's show and demonstrate some unity. That's what's going to bring us back. That's what's going to appeal to the middle ground. That's what's going to help us win the next general election.
Tobias Ellwood, it's always a pleasure, my friend. We really appreciate you giving us our time on Bank Holiday Monday. Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP for Bournemouth East and ex-chair of the Defence Select Committee, covering so many issues.